Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. I am Josh, that is Jason, that is our guest tonight, Mark Shaw. This is Conversations on the Fringe, live with you every Friday night, 7:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And this is where we talk about those things that usually just don't get talked about on the standard news and media. And tonight, in the preemptive summary of what's happening here, we got what I believe it's Sunday, Mark, correct? Is the 58th anniversary of JFK assassination. Is that correct?
Actually, Monday.
Monday. So Monday. So the 58th anniversary of the JFK assassination, we brought Mark Shaw on. If you guys don't remember Mark Shaw, he's the author of more than 20 books, former legal analyst for the USA Today, CNN, USA Today, a California attorney and investigative reporter who has dedicated the past 10 years of his life probing the truth about the JFK assassination and the Lee Harvey Oswald assassination. His latest book, Collateral Damage, The Mysterious Death of Marilyn Monroe and Dorothy Kilgallen, and all the ties that bind them together to Robert Kennedy and the JFK assassination. We welcome back Mark Shaw. Mark, how have you been?
I'm good. I'm sorry about the longest subtitle in literary history. I get carried away a little bit with that. So, but yes, I'm good, and it's been exciting now since the book was released in June. I've got some new information to be able to give you tonight that kind of confirms what's in the book. So that's exciting.
Well, that's awesome. I would love to start with that. Well, actually, one tidbit about the book is this Mark Wahlberg stuff. Tell us a little bit about that. That's pretty exciting.
Well, it is. Collateral Damage was published in June, and at some particular point, there was a connection there. Mark Wahlberg is a partner with two others, Archie Gips and a guy named Levinson, in Unrealistic Ideas, which is the production company they have. They produce a lot of documentaries and different kinds of things. And a connection was made with them. And about a month ago now, we concluded negotiations, and they have the media rights to Collateral Damage. And their intent is to produce a documentary film, feature film based on Collateral Damage. I picked them because of their integrity, but also because they assured me that they will follow my book. It's about this thick. I don't know if we looked at it the last time. It's the thickest book I've ever read. Whether it's that good or not, I don't know, but it's thick.
Yeah.
So readers get their money's worth when they read it. But I wanted somebody who would stay true to the story because this is my contribution to history, and I think connecting the deaths of Marilyn Monroe, JFK, and Dorothy Kilgallen for the very first time. It's a breakthrough book, and we'll talk about that, but that's why I wanted them to assure me that they'll stay true to what's in the book.
Fantastic. Well, congratulations on that. That is absolutely awesome. And I'm definitely a book guy. I got the books upstairs, and I can't wait for the documentary to come out because I always look at the book and the movie, right? And you always compare them at the end. And it's very hard. Very, very hard to match them. So I very rarely ever like the movie more than I like the book. I always like the book way better because it's always more detailed. But we'll see. I mean, Mark Wahlberg's team on this one, this is going to be interesting. So congratulations on that. So tell us about some of these latest developments. I know that we had Joe Biden stop the release of a lot of these JFK documents.
Well, let's start with that then, because that's really disappointing. Josh, it's interesting. You go back a few presidents, including the most recent former president. Then you go to Obama and Clinton and Bush and all of them. They have been required by law to expose the rest of the JFK documents that have been compiled for years. And their excuse has always been, it's a matter of national security that we don't want to release these documents. Well, that was hard to swallow all these years, but I don't know who advised President Biden, but here's what he said in the release where he told us that he's not going to release them this year, maybe next. Now, I just get this. They're denying the release so as to protect against identifiable harm to the military defense, intelligence operations, law enforcement, and the conduct of foreign relations. What in the world in those documents can be identifiable harm to the military defense, identifiable harm to intelligence operations, identifiable harm to law enforcement, and identifiable harm to the conduct of foreign relations? That's a joke, frankly. That's just an excuse, and a lame excuse. And so I'm very disturbed with that. Even the Kennedy family, which I'm not I'm in favor of a great deal, as you know, they've all come out and said, "Hey, let's get the documents." What I'm worried about here is everybody's going to get so excited about these documents coming out. My bet is that they will parallel the bogus Warren Commission, look at Lee Harvey Oswald as the alone assassin and all of that, but we may never know. I don't know whether in 2022 Biden will come up with another excuse of some sort, but there's something in there that they're hiding, and it's disturbing. We all need to know exactly what that's about.
Yep, and I love history, and I love looking into this. There's a great documentary out there known as A Rich Man's Trick, and they go through this. And it's interesting that you mentioned military, law enforcement, foreign relationships, and the intelligence community, because aren't those all four of the groups that came together really to make this happen?
Well, it's difficult to tell, if who was really involved in that group. As you know, I'm a Dorothy Kilgallen believer, the revered journalist who covered the Jack Ruby trial and then gave up her life because she was too close to the truth and all of that. She really, focused on Carlos Marcello, who was the New Orleans Don and who I've proven in my books, the bestseller, The Reporter Who Knew Too Much, and others, that he had the greatest motive to have eliminated JFK, so Bobby Kennedy would be powerless, because, as you know, when the Kennedys got into the White House, they did so by calling in certain underworld friends of Joe's through Joe Kennedy's through Frank Sinatra, and I think you're aware of one of them, but it was Frank Costello in New York, and Trafficante in Florida, and Marcello in New Orleans, and Giancana in Chicago. And so she focused really on Jack Ruby and exactly how he got involved in this. I had practiced law, I think you remember, with Melvin Belli, who was Jack Ruby's lawyer, and I practiced law with him in the 1980s, so I knew him, and I was really quizzical of his investigation of Ruby's case, and then him representing Ruby, not letting him testify, using an insanity defense, all these other kind of things. And I've proven in Collateral Damage that he actually knew about the JFK assassination before it happened. So that was the thread that I used with Dorothy. Now, all these other theories and everything have merit to them, but Dorothy, I believe, I wasn't there in 1963 at the Ruby trial or anything. Dorothy was. So all the other experts out there and the authors and everything, like me, we weren't there. But if you look at Dorothy Kilgallen's column she wrote from the Ruby trial and all of that, I think it's the most credible evidence we have, along with the Jack Ruby trial transcripts, which I exposed in the book previous to Collateral Damage called Denial of Justice.
Right. Sam Giancana, this is an interesting figure here, because the Jacob Rubenstein, which is Jack Ruby, leads directly to Sam Giancana, which obviously Chicago and had dealings in Texas. This relates to tons of people, including Carlos Marcello. And so they had this syndicate. Now, it was interesting because it was right after World War II that most of the Sicilian crime families were decimated. They were gone. I mean, Mussolini had put all of them in jail here in the United States. I mean, Luciano was in prison. They were all basically done. And the federal government went to them to actually help out with everything that was happening with the German war effort. And so this is how they rose back up again in power. You had Jack Kennedy obviously rise up in the power during the 20s and the 30s during these times. He got in a lot of trouble. He went to Sam Giancana for help. And this is how JFK and Robert both get elected eventually. And the mob are looking at this like, oh my God, we got someone in the White House. We're going to be primed. This is going to be awesome. And John and Robert had something else in mind, didn't they?
Yeah, they double-crossed him.
Yeah.
Joe Kennedy made this deal with the devil. You help us win West Virginia and Illinois and use Mayor Daley, who's the most corrupt mayor who may have ever lived, to win those states. And when we get in the White House, we'll leave you guys alone. Well, immediately, I had an eyewitness who was there when Joe Kennedy ordered JFK to appoint Bobby Kennedy Attorney General. And predictably, Bobby Kennedy, who hated those guys, went after them, deported. They charged Giancana with tax evasion and all other kinds of things, all of those guys. But with Marcello, he deported Marcello illegally to Guatemala, And then when he got back in the country, he was going to deport him again, charged with racketeering. And so as you get to the end of 1963, Marcello's saying, I've had it. I want to kill that SOB Bobby Kennedy. But if I do that, then Jack Kennedy will come after me with everything the government has. So I'll orchestrate the death of JFK. Bobby will be powerless. And that's exactly what happened. They never went after those guys again. So there's a thread there that goes along, and then it will touch, as we will talk about tonight, into even the death of Marilyn Monroe in 1963 or 1962.
I love this. This is like it's like uncovering history that people not forget about, but it's just not there on the surface level, and people can't see it. And so when we have these discussions, I think it's incredibly important, especially on an investigative side as well as a historical side, because it's showing people a whole different view of what happened or what potentially happened that they might not know.
And, you're right, because I'll pat myself on the back because I look at the JFK assassination differently than anybody else has. I've got 5 books here that I've written about the JFK assassination, almost 15 years of research. If you look at the JFK assassination as to why Bobby wasn't killed instead of why JFK was, it changes everything. Because, for instance, the Ruby trial prosecutor, Bill Alexander, when I interviewed him, he said, well, Mark, I thought it was going to be Bobby killed. He had a lot more enemies than JFK did, especially in the underworld and all of that. So if you look at it that way, it really does change everything. And I would like to talk a little bit tonight about the fact that even though I believe, and most all of the critics and everybody else that believes that what I have come up with in my books are the most plausible scenarios under how this happened, there are still people out there who refuse to believe that. And I especially have seen that, Josh, with regard to the release of Collateral Damage, because I nail Bobby Kennedy, no question about it, for orchestrating Marilyn Monroe's death.
Right.
But I tell you what, if I produce 50 witnesses, there still would be those people out there who remember Camelot, and they love Bobby. The Los Angeles District Attorney, who I've asked to reinvestigate Marilyn's deaths, said during some discussions about the Sirhan parole, I idolized Bobby Kennedy. I thought he would make a great president. Well, obviously, he's not going to look into any of the allegations in my book, even though I sent it to him in this evidence report and everything. But it's interesting to me, and other things in life, I'd be interested to see what you two think of why people really don't want to know the truth. Now, of course, we can go to the most famous movie, A Few Good Men, with Jack Nicholson, remember?
Yeah.
When he's got, when he says, you don't want to know the truth, or whatever it is, something like that.
You can't handle the truth.
And I just feel like that maybe at times people just don't want to know the truth, and it doesn't matter what you're going to tell them. Why do you think that is?
Jay, go first, because I could do a whole 8-hour segment on that.
This is a good one. This is a really good question. So I think it just comes down to is that it ruins the perception of their reality.
That's it.
Right?
Ruins their paradigm.
Yeah, ruins their paradigm.
Perfect.
And, paradigm shifts are incredibly difficult to have happen, right?
Yeah, you have to have new information that comes in, and if that information that comes in is speculative to them, it's not immediate to them, it's very hard for that paradigm to shift. And for most people, especially the people who are familiar with the JFK assassination, they're much older in their ways and their beliefs, of which they were indoctrinated by the mainstream media for a very, very long time. Hey, this is a Bruder film, this is the way it was, this is the way it happened, this is what your government told you, and this is how it happened. And for someone to come in and say, no, but look at this and this and this, and it's just like, no, it's, I don't want to remember Jack and Jack that way, or I don't want to remember John that way, or Bobby that way. I want to remember them this way. And it's that transition of belief.
I feel a little bit like Dorothy Kilgallen must have in 1963 when she was at the trial. She's the only reporter to interview Jack Ruby. She writes all these columns, the Oswald file must not close. She connects Ruby and Oswald and Marcello and all these people, and she goes to New Orleans and she investigates Marcello, but nobody would listen to her because you got J. Edgar Hoover out there yelling Oswald alone, and because you know why that is, because if it's a nut like Oswald, then the FBI can't be responsible. But if it's a plot to kill the president, then obviously they could. So he's shouting now out, here's Dorothy, this revered Pulitzer Prize nominated journalist who, is syndicated to 200 newspapers across the country, the famous star on What's My Line, and all of this integrity to her and all of that. New York Post called her the most powerful female voice in America. And she's shouting, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. We need to look into this. But nobody asked the right questions and nobody would listen to her. And sometimes I feel like that, unfortunately.
And that's the sad state of how information is manipulated, controlled, and disseminated these days, even with the advent of the internet, a powerful tool like that, is that you can be shut down immediately simply because someone with authority or power disagrees with what you're saying.
That's right. That's right. And that's sad in a lot of ways. I mean, they silenced Dorothy, and we'll explain how they silenced Marilyn Monroe. If you get too close to the truth, you got to watch yourself. People ask me all the time, if I'm worried about my safety with writing these books and everything. And I've gotten some pretty strange emails, and my email's been hacked, and my Facebook page and all that. But, for the most part, that's not what we worry about. That's not what you and Jay worry about when you come on the air and you say some things that are going to irritate people, because that's what we do. I've got a little saying up on my wall. I don't know if I gave it to you the last time, but it says, "The dead cannot cry out for justice. It is the duty of the living to do so for them."
I love that.
And I kind of follow that, but we can't worry about what other people think. Hopefully we make them stop and think. That's what we want to do. But we're going to irritate some people.
100%. I mean, we got a guest that comes on our show regularly that's got a hit on his head by the Mexican cartels. Really? And, I mean, he's right on the border in Del Rio. He owns land down there. And he's taken his security detail going over the border and taking pictures and sharing this with law enforcement and uncovering what's actually happening on the border. And he's been on my show a few times. He goes, "Hey, don't be surprised if you get some phone calls from people threatening your life because you had me on your show." But we understand that certain information has to be told, and someone needs to tell that story. And if people were completely afraid to tell that story and always, bowed down to the threats, then the truth would never be known. And see, I think it's our job as people who go out there that investigate these things to bring the truth to the surface and to get it out to the people, to allow them to make their own judgment, their own discernment upon what the truth potentially could be with about the best information that they have available.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I like Jay's answer to my question because, they didn't ask enough questions back. People say, how's this relevant? What relevance is there with what you do? Yeah. Well, it's about history, first of all, and I try to find distortions of history, identify them, and do something about that. But, people didn't ask a lot of questions back then. When Marilyn died, for instance, as we'll talk about, Dorothy Kilgallen wrote about what great spirit she was in a couple days before she died, and all these kind of things we'll mention. Well, nobody then questioned the fact that she supposedly committed probable suicide, they call it. Dorothy Kilgallen didn't have a drug problem or anything, but when they found her and found an empty bottle of Seconal, they said, well, she overdosed on drugs, and I'd proven that wasn't true, and it wasn't true about Marilyn. With JFK, it's amazing because it's only come to mind recently. If you really want to cover up a murder, just falsify the autopsies.
Yeah.
Because in these three cases, that's exactly what happened. Cyril Wecht, who would be a really good guest for you, by the way, the forensic scientist who's so famous, incredible. I will connect you with him. He looked at the autopsy of JFK and basically called it a joke. Yeah. First of all, they should have had the autopsy at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, but they shipped the body as quickly as they could back to a military base there in Washington, D.C. And these, amateur, forensics people examined his body, and Cyril Wecht can talk about that. He also looked at Marilyn's autopsy. Dr. Thomas Noguchi, that name. Yep. He actually was the junior medical examiner who examined Marilyn's body. And you know what? He just happened to forget and finally admit that he forgot to look at some of her inner organs. And by the time he figured that out, they'd been destroyed. There's another false autopsy. And in Dorothy's case, I confronted Dr. Michael Baden, who's another famous forensic guy, on a radio show in New York about 6 months ago. I had to tell him that his name was on Dorothy Kilgallen's autopsy, What? I said, yeah. And you said that she died of an overdose of drugs. And he said, oh, no, we didn't really know what happened, Mark. That's why we put circumstances undetermined. But that's not what they told the media, you see. So if you really want to falsify a murder, just start with that autopsy.
100%.
Just to pay off the mortician, or right? Is it for
the Undertaker, or the coroner, the coroner,
pay off the Undertaker, huh?
the coroner, yeah.
And that just doesn't happen in these kinds of cases. I get, letters and emails from people about a sister, a brother, a son, whatever it might be, and they're very upset about the fact that their loved one was killed, and the DA won't investigate, or they investigate and they come back against all the evidence that they have that it was an accident of some sort. So it's just not famous people. This happens all the time, unfortunately, and that's very sad that it does.
This is interesting. So, and it's gonna kind of, once I tell the story, you'll understand this statement. But the lies become the truth, and truth becomes lies, right? Mm-hmm. So there was this couple. They just gotten a new home. They moved to it. They were doing home renovations, things like that. His wife gets deathly ill. She goes to the hospital. She gets better. She comes back home. They start to just relive their lives. She gets sick again, goes back to the hospital. Third time it happens again, third time, same scenario. This time they draw her blood. They start looking for poisons and things in her blood, and they find arsenic. So the cops go to the house. They arrest the husband. Obviously he's poisoning her. They find some rat poison that's arsenic based. They said, oh, you're putting this in her drink, right? He goes through the ringer, and he gets this defense attorney who figures it out. When they were going through their home renovations, they were using the old pressure-treated lumber, which was made with arsenic. And that's what was getting her sick. And he got him acquitted from it. But why do we have to get to this point where, somebody just has an idea, an investigator, whatever it is, and all of a sudden that's what happened. That's the truth. Meanwhile, they went through his financials. They put him through the ringer, and they're like, oh, he's going to go bankrupt. He needed her to die. And we see this over and over and over again, where society is so quick to judge on really the outcome. And once they hear that, they're hooked. And I think that's why we have this hard paradigm shift. The lies become the truth, and the truth become lies.
And on top of that, I will tell you, based on my years as a former criminal defense lawyer and all of that, the police want to close cases. They want to make the headline, we figured this out, and all of that. And so you have that unfortunate mindset as they go into an awful lot of these cases. Does anybody really believe that Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide in that cell of his? Come on. All of those famous people he could have squealed on and everything, and he ends up supposedly committing suicide. But you see, that closed the case. I've run into that with the New York District Attorney, who investigated Dorothy Kilgallen's case for a while, and then basically they admitted they wanted to close it, even though they knew she was murdered and she didn't die accidentally. And now I can't get Gaston, the LA District Attorney, to look into Marilyn's death again, because that case is closed, Mark, and we've got more important things to do. So I'll bet in that case that you just talked about, that's really an injustice that took place. And that can destroy somebody's life, all the funds that they have, everything, but especially their reputation, because the three of us know if a headline is in a newspaper on the front page that somebody, has been arrested or whatever it may be that way, when they find out that the evidence is not strong enough and that person really did not commit the crime, they put it on page 10.
Yep.
And nobody ever knows about that, and that person's life is destroyed.
Yep.
Indeed.
Right. Yeah.
So watch yourselves, you two. Be very careful.
Absolutely. J.D. Tippett was the police officer who died on the same day. He was also, they called him John, or JFK Jr., right? They called him JFK because he looked a lot like John F. Kennedy. He idolized him. He died on the same day, and it was rumored, and I don't know if there's any truth to that the body was switched. Because if you remember, when Jackie got off the plane in D.C., she says, that's not him. That's not John. And she was looking at who many believed to be J.D. Tippett, because they switched the bodies out because they had to do reconstructive surgery to show that the bullet wound actually came from the back, not the front, which I think we can all know that the bullet wound is back into the left. Back into left doesn't happen from a bullet that came from back here, right?
Well, the two real confusing characters there, in one in Daily Plaza and one in on the streets there, Oswald, supposedly in the book depository. Dorothy Kilgallen figured out in her mind that he was a confusing character. There was a dead end there. She couldn't figure out who the hell he was, whether he was really in Russia or he was in Mexico, or there were three of them or whatever that way. With Tippett, nobody can quite figure out if you look at common sense with a lot of these things, and you look at motive and all these other kind of things, things spill out pretty easily. Well, can you imagine, Oswald supposedly leaves the book depository, and then why in the world, as Dorothy Kilgallen put in one of her columns, would he just somehow or another get himself involved with shooting a police officer? It makes no real sense if you think about it, but people bought that. Tippett also had been at Jack Ruby's Carousel Club. All the police in Dallas had been there. Dorothy wrote a column. Since she was in New York City, of course, she knew all the celebrities there and the different acts, the jugglers and everything else. And she wrote a column that said that she talked to a lot of them, and they said, oh, yeah, we were at Jack Ruby's Carousel Club with all the police who were there being comped for the drinks and all that kind of stuff. And that connects with the Ruby trial transcripts, because in there, it talks about Jack Ruby being there when Oswald was going to be transferred, that he got into the basement with the police help. He acted like a reporter to get in there and all of that kind of thing. And so, this whole crap about him just showing up there at the basement made no sense. And it shows really that there was a plot going on to kill JFK and all of that. But again, I go back to the fact that, Tippett is a character that nobody can quite figure out. It's just like that. Yesterday I was talking on a program and they were talking about, well, where'd the shots come from, Mark? And didn't they come from the grassy knoll or the book depository or from a old sedan or something and all that? And I said, well, I can't get into that, except that I know the account that Chief of Police of Dallas, Jesse Curry, gave in his autobiography that he wrote after the JFK assassination. And the first thing he said that I did when I heard the shots was I sent my officers to the overpass. Well, to me, that's the primary source, accountable. This makes an awful lot of sense. If that's what he heard and that's what he did, then possibly, at least, more probably than anything else, that's where the shots came up from. But Tippett is a very confusing character. I don't know how many other people have really looked into his background or whatever, whether he had financial problems, whatever. But he was somehow or another in the wrong place at the right time, because along comes Oswald, and unfortunately, of course, he dies. Tippett dies.
Oh, that's crazy. So what's this new information that you have on Carlos Marcello that you discovered in the overlooked 50-page FBI file pertaining to his multi-million-dollar empire?
Well, I can tell you that two tips that I got that led to evidence, and I'd have to think about them for a minute, that are in Collateral, that are in my file now to use for the paperback edition of Collateral Damage, came from viewers of your show last time.
Oh, wow.
And that happens to me a great deal, where people will hear me on these programs or presentations or whatever. There's a couple of my presentations up on YouTube. There's almost 700,000 views of those now. So people watch them or watch your show or whatever, and they get in touch with me. And we'll talk about in a little while the most plausible means by how Marilyn Monroe died, because I got my tips about that to confirm what I have in the book. But as far as Marcello goes, now think about this. In 1963, he was a multimillionaire. His empire in Dallas, in New Orleans, stretched to Dallas. He had his underlings there, Joe Savello and so on and so forth. Yep. Ruby actually had his dinner the night before he shot Oswald at one of those restaurants. But Marcello was very wealthy. He was a landowner. He was a very smart businessman. And in my book, I use an estimate by a couple other researchers that showed he was probably worth about $30 million in 1963. Well, you can imagine how much that would be in current dollars. Yeah. So he cannot let Bobby Kennedy throw him in prison. He cannot let Bobby Kennedy deport him, or that empire is going down. And then when JFK is dead, and even when Bobby Kennedy is not Attorney General anymore, here comes along Dorothy Kilgallen, who's writing this book for Random House, who's interviewed everybody in New Orleans and all of that. And he can't possibly let her write that book for Random House, because it would have exposed him as orchestrating JFK's death, and it would have shown the cover up by J. Edgar Hoover. So there's motive right there for him not only killing JFK, but also then going ahead and eliminating Dorothy Kilgallen. So this new file, it came to me from a woman in Texas, and I'll have more information about her in a little while, because she can actually be a witness to, in the summer of 1963, seeing Carlos Marcello and Jack Ruby together in Dallas at the Adolphus Hotel near Daley Plaza. But what she gave me is this FBI file, and it has all these informants in it the FBI had, and it shows that as about 67 and 68, Marcello had at least doubled or tripled his empire. And he was a very smart businessman. For instance, you've probably heard of Churchill Farms, which was the estate that he had near New Orleans, where supposedly they used some of the ponds to get rid of dead bodies, and he met with people and all of that. It was a huge estate. Well, this FBI file, for instance, shows that he was buying land around Churchill Farms because he found out that the government was going to build an interstate highway through there. There's meetings that he had with F. Lee Bailey, with Melvin Belli, that he had connections with Jim Garrison in New Orleans. I mean, all this is in that FBI file. But what I found most interesting is that, again, his empire has increased, and you're probably way ahead of me with this, both of you, but what happened in 1968? Bobby Kennedy was killed.
Right.
Because, in my opinion, and I believe that Marcello had the strongest motive to do so, although I haven't been able to prove it yet, but I'm working on it. Because what happens if Bobby Kennedy becomes President of the United States? He knew, as he told many of his subordinates and everything, Marcello is the one who killed my brother. So what's Marcello saying to himself? If Bobby becomes president, he's going to come after me. Yep. So his empire, which had grown in size and everything, is at stake now. And that really was interesting to me, because I'd never really thought about that until this woman sent me this FBI file.
Huh. That's crazy.
Isn't it, though?
It really is.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's some of the new information. A lot of what I found is really just confirmation that it's in Collateral Damage, but that was one of the things. Yeah.
So switch gears a little bit. Tell me about this evidence proving that Marilyn Monroe's home was bugged during the months leading up to her death.
I'm sure that you guys have some of your tips come from the damnedest places, things you never thought would happen. So in Collateral Damage, I have what I call the Rothberg Report. And when I was looking at Bobby Kennedy as a main suspect in Marilyn's death, I had a couple vehicles to do that. One was a letter from the president's, Bobby and Jack's sister, Jean Kennedy Smith. And it said to Marilyn, "I hear you and Bobby are the new item, ! When Bobby comes back east, please come back with him," which showed the relationship there.
Right.
And that had all come about a little bit by accident, because I wasn't going to investigate the death of Marilyn Monroe. I'd had enough, I thought, of the books with The Reporter Who Knew Too Much, Denial of Justice, and all of that. But people, like that watch your show and everything, came to me and said, "Hey, is there a connection between the deaths, life and times and deaths of Marilyn Monroe and Dorothy Kilgallen?" Well, I found a photograph that's in Collateral Damage of the two of them together on a 1960 film over at 20th Century Fox. And I had always been suspect of Marilyn committing suicide. But when I found an article written by Dorothy, it was all about Marilyn being on the upswing. She's going to Hollywood parties. She's got offers for Broadway shows and Las Vegas shows and all of that. And she's involved with a bigger name romantically than Joe DiMaggio, who was her second husband, the New York Yankees Hall of Fame baseball star. And so when I finally looked at the autopsy of Marilyn's and all of that, read Dorothy's columns and everything, I thought, wait a minute, who's this big name, and I landed on JFK. Because, as you know, they had a love affair after she sang happy birthday to him at his 35th birthday in New York City at Madison Square Garden. But I found out that was short-lived. So who's the next big name? Bobby Kennedy. Yeah. So I started looking into him, and I found this Rothberg Report. And on the second page, it said, it was issued just before Marilyn died. Bobby Kennedy has had a torrid love affair with Marilyn Monroe during the summer of 1962, to the extent that he has told her he is going to divorce Ethel and marry Marilyn. Well, how did they find out that? If you go to the first page of that document, and it'll get into UFOs in a minute as well, in the first paragraph of that document, it talks about 2 wiretaps. One is Dorothy Kilgallen and a friend of hers named Rothberg, who was an antiques dealer in New York City. And that particular wiretapped conversation talks about that Rothberg and Dorothy talked about Dorothy and Marilyn and JFK's obsession with UFOs. Huh. And I knew that Dorothy had the obsession because she went to actually what they called a UFO convention in London in 1954. And I found a photograph of her, and I found an article she wrote about it and all that. So I knew that about her. With Marilyn, I had understood that she was interested in all of that, but not, enough evidence to really do too much with it. But this particular document then connected the 3 of them with UFOs because it said that JFK was absolutely obsessed with UFOs. And I found a document then that confirmed that, where he was ordering the CIA to find all the evidence it could about Roswell and all of that. And if other people found out that I was interested in this, they might think I'm a little dilly. Which would have probably caused him problems with the re-election. So that was in the first part. And then the second part of that, I knew because it said that there was a wiretap of Marilyn and Robert Kennedy's phone calls. And the information it had in there leads directly to the motive as to why Marilyn was killed, and then I'll get to your question. Because what it said in there, Marilyn was upset at an event that she went to at a hotel on the border of Nevada and California, the Cal Neva Hotel, the weekend before she died. Sinatra was there, Peter Lawford was there, all kinds of celebrities were there and everything, including Sam Giancana. Huh. And she got the feeling they were going to pass her around. As she said, they were treating me like a piece of meat. And finally, she yelled and screamed up there, and she said, I'm going to the media with all this. I'm going to tell about the Kennedy love affair. And also, as it says in this CIA document, I'm going to expose the fact that John Kennedy is planning the assassination of Fidel Castro. Well, as you can imagine, it would have been bad enough for Marilyn to go to the media about the love affairs. But if she goes to the media about the matters of national security, the Kennedys are cooked. Yep. So they couldn't let her do that, and that is going to lead, as we'll talk about, to the means by which Bobby orchestrated her death, because I proved he was in LA and all of that. But to answer your question, it's interesting because a listener, I believe it was one of the people who watched the interview I had at the Commonwealth Club of San Francisco. And this morning it crossed the fact that there's been 500,000 people who've looked at this video. Well, one of them wrote me and said, you need to find the article about Veronica Hamill, who, as you remember, was a star on Hill Street Blues. She and her husband bought Marilyn's home in 1972. And according to Veronica Hamill, they hired a contractor to replace the roof and remodel the house. And the contractor discovered a sophisticated eavesdropping and telephone tapping system that covered every room in the house.
Wow.
Now that's an objective account, no reason to lie about it,
yeah,
of someone who confirms the fact of the wiretapping that took place that's in the CIA documents. So I love that kind of confirmation because it really provides legitimacy for what I'm trying to explain in terms of my theories that are in Collateral Damage. Isn't that amazing?
That is pretty amazing. It's crazy how it all kind of like fits together like a little puzzle, you know? And in that even this many years, you know, almost 60 years later, you can start piecing it together and actually make sense of all that evidence.
Well, I hope so. We basically resolved three true crime murder mysteries in Collateral Damage. There weren't mysteries at all. And I'll go ahead and give you, and I think I did the last time, but this conclusion that I came up with that really hasn't gotten any attack to it. Nobody's come back and said, Mark, you're crazy yet. Because if you think about it, if Robert Kennedy would have been prosecuted for Marilyn Monroe's death in 1962, based on all the evidence that I can share with you, then he would have had to have resigned as Attorney General. That means Marcello, Giancana, all those people, they wouldn't have had to have assassinated, Marcello especially, JFK, to render Bobby powerless, because he would have been powerless. And then you stretch that further, Dorothy Kilgallen would have not been killed in 1965 when she got too close to the truth about the JFK assassination and going to write it in the book, because there would have been no JFK assassination. So the collateral damage of Bobby and Joe Kennedy's abuses of power in 61 and 62 led to the three deaths of these three people within 40 months of each other. Marilyn at 36, JFK at 46, Dorothy at 52. And I get really emotional about this, Josh, I will tell you. Those two women should not have died. There's no reason why they should have, except for the abuse of power by the Kennedys.
Yeah, and there's massive other abuses of power as well. I mean, you got all the other players in here as well. That really this whole situation was developed because of the abuse of power by lots of people. Is you have crime syndicates that are operating here in the United States during this time that evolved out of World War II. They evolved out of Prohibition. They evolved out of the Great Depression. Our country allowed them to rise up. You had the big multinational corporations, the oil tycoons and so forth, and they're all criminal. They were all criminal, and they all had a piece of the pie, and the Kennedys basically tried to screw them all when they came in to try to do something right for their family. And you're right, that caused the death of Marilyn and Dorothy there. And
would you repeat that story you told me, or that account that you told me, because I had never heard it before, coming out of World War II, and Italy and Mussolini with regard to the crime syndicates. I found that very interesting, and I don't think many people know about that. Would you repeat that for me? Yeah.
So World War II is not what people really think it is. And this is kind of a really hard red pill to swallow for a lot of people. If I asked anybody a few questions, in the sense is, what kind of trucks did the Germans use to invade France with? Fords.
Henry Ford.
Yep, Fords. Adolf Hitler actually had a painting picture of Henry Ford in his office. Okay, the actual Auschwitz. The name was changed to a German name to make it sound more German. Now, these were slave labor camps originally that were actually controlled by the Brown Harriman Company, right? And so you have all this time, so Brown Harriman...
I don't know who that is. Who's that?
So you never heard of Averell Harriman?
Oh, yes.
Okay, you need to look up Averell Harriman and do as much research as possible on him, because that's directly connected to the JFK assassination.
Fascinating.
Yep. And so Averell Harriman, he basically comes up along the same time as Prescott Bush. And this is the bank that they had was, I want to say Union Bank. It was Union Bank. And this was the primary bank that funded a lot of the Nazis in Germany. I mean, you had the Vatican supporting Germany. You had...
Yes, I'm reading a book about that right now.
Yeah.
Mussolini and the Pope.
That's
disturbing.
Right. It is very disturbing.
Disturbing.
So basically what you have is this rise of communism, which all these multinationalists, they wanted to protect their money, their power, and their interests, and they just saw the Bolshevik Revolution occur. So they basically turned Germany into this powerhouse to go against the rest of Europe, to rise up against this communism, utilizing the other front of socialism. They fund the whole war, the bankers on both sides, the Warburgs, Morgan, so forth, Averell, Harriman, their whole families. They fund both sides of the war, right? And so it's no surprise that World War II was basically this multinational corporation putting countries at war together to make a profit, to make a buck, right? War is a racket. This gets into Smedley Butler. I don't know if you know who Smedley Butler is.
I do not.
3-star Marine Corps general. He has 2 medals of honor. Would have had 3, but at the time that he got his first one, the Marine Corps was not offering the Medal of Honor at that point in time. So he's a two-time Medal of Honor recipient, 3-star general. Okay?
Right.
He was approached by a group of multinational bankers. He later identified as Prescott Bush. This is the granddaddy, or the father of George Herbert Walker Bush, right? Herbert Walker, who is a partner of the Union Bank, as well as the Brown Harriman brothers, okay? So he was approached by these guys to basically take a 500,000 veteran army, go in and take the presidency from FDR and produce a dictatorship, fascist dictatorship, done by the oligarchs here in the United States. He testified in front of Congress. So basically what Smedley Butler did, and this was about, I think, 38, around that time, is he got with these guys, met with them at the docks, enough to learn who was involved, and then he went directly to FDR, because he had FDR's ear. And he told FDR. He testified in Congress about it, and you want to know what happened? Nothing. Those guys should have been hung for that. Nothing happened from this. So this all evolves out, right? And so in Italy during World War II, Mussolini went about and he arrested all of the families, all the Sicilian families, all the mafia. Okay? The same thing was happening here in the United States. The Luciano family was deported back to Sicily.
Right, I did know that.
Yeah, they had eliminated all of the majority of the mob here in the United States, but we came out of World War II into the Great Depression. And they needed to utilize the resources the mob had already built up to basically rebirth everything that was going to happen for the New Deal because of the trade and the union laborists. Mm-hmm. So the trade labor, right? So they basically, the U.S. government funded, the intelligence communities funded the rebirth of the mafiosos here in the United States. This includes Marcello. This includes Giaccani. All these guys rose out of this infrastructure that was built up at that time. Now, this is interesting because it ties directly back to World War II, because this is where the U.S. intelligence apparatus originally developed from, the OSS. Now, one of the head guys in the OSS was Prescott Bush, the same person who was funding the Nazis. Now, what's interesting is if we go back to Project Paperclip, and you know what Project Paperclip is, right? Where we went.
I've heard of that, yes.
Werner von Braun, all these guys. The one man who went into Germany, went over the West Wall and got all these people and brought them back. He was an OSS agent, a U.S. Army intelligence agent, who was one of the first officers at OSS, who worked with basically this multinational corporation that now established an intelligence infrastructure in our government. His name, Henry Kissinger.
My goodness.
Yep.
Wow.
And so they bring all these people over, right? And they start basically putting them out into government in the strategic points and places like this. And then obviously Kennedy gets elected. Well, Kennedy comes out and he starts talking about this group that is operating in the shadows, right? Mm-hmm. And obviously they operate through secret societies, and there's a whole occultist aspect to this that we won't get into tonight. But the Skull and Bones, the 322s, are directly associated with this whole regime that created World War I, World War II, that created this intelligence infrastructure that eventually became the military-industrial complex, the intelligence complex that ran our government, and they couped JFK, exactly what we're saying here, because of many different financial interests that they had with the mafiosos, Giaccani, with Marcello, as well as with oil tycoons and their multinational corporations. And JFK wanted to expose it all and to end it all. And so they had just as much, motivation as Marcello did to have him dead. And it's believed by many that they all collaborated together. This is people like E. Howard Hunt. This is how George Herbert Walker Bush comes into play. There's a photograph out there of George Herbert Walker Bush at the Dallas Police Department the day JFK came in the town. He's right there. You can see him. He was a young CIA agent during that time. We know that Hoover was neighbors with LBJ during this time. LBJ and Hoover had massive money invested in Cuban oil. And that goes back to what we just talked about there, is this Cuban oil, which goes back to, what's his name? Crichton, Jack Crichton. Jack Crichton and George Herbert Walker Bush created a company that went over, made deals with Cuba, and this was pre Bay of Pigs. Well, Castro reneged on the deals. This is why the intelligence group, went in there and created the Bay of Pigs incidents, which pissed JFK off, is because Castro reneged on the deal and dropped it down to 20,000 acres, which their company got delisted off the New York Stock Exchange because they lost $30 million in just a few days because of Castro reneging on that deal. And so they were pretty pissed off at that time, and they knew that John F. Kennedy was pissed now because the Bay of Pigs incidents just happened. They almost created an international war, and he was going to expose them for that, which means that their whole empires come down. And LBJ looks at this going, well, man, if JFK stays in office, I'm done. I'm a goner. But if he dies, man, I get to be president, and I don't get in trouble, and I get to keep my fortune? Huh. So there's this whole other aspect.
Yeah. Let me ask you how this fits in then.
Yeah.
I've always been puzzled as to the motive by J. Edgar Hoover of, as you know, basically denying that there was any sort of crime syndicate, that there was any mafioso. He wouldn't even use that word. While he pals around with Frank Costello, going to the races, and when he loses, then Marcello covers his bets, Costello covers his bets and all that other kind of stuff. Do you believe that? Is there good reason to believe that Hoover then was protecting those interests of those people? Is that a rational way of looking at that? Because I've never looked at it in quite that context.
Well, let me ask you a question, Mark. If I'm paying your debts, right, at the game, because you're gambling, I own you. No ifs, ands, or buts about it.
So there's actually
seems to be that this is how politics is played.
Well, but on the other hand, remember what, so Hoover's an enabler in some ways, but also remember, he had these files. He was never going to be displaced as FBI director because he had all the dirt in the world on the Kennedys and just about everybody else, including Johnson and all of that. He's such a quizzical character here. Yeah, I understand what you're saying with Costello owning him, but I still am not quite sure that all makes sense, but it makes more sense to me now in terms of what Josh has said. I can see it more in context there as to why he was basically, if you go back, you'll see all the speeches by him. There was no mafia, he said.
So what's interesting is, whose tracks was he going to bet on the horses with? Who owned the tracks?
Yeah, I guess that would be something to know about, yes.
Yep, that's the mafia. Which means that the way they paid off Hoover is he would go place a bet, and they'd just pay him a little bit more, even if he lost. Secondarily, Hoover was a closet homosexual. And there is plenty of evidence pertaining to that, hidden pictures at that time of him and his boyfriend, of which, if came out during that time, he would have lost all power and been forced to resign. So they had a certain amount of power over him. The money aspect, they controlled him with money, and he was being paid off. Now, the investment that I actually talked about, how he got in with LBJ in the sense of the oil fields and his investment in oil came about, is because of the money that he was being paid by Giaccani at the tracks.
I understand. And let me tell you then this story of a woman in Dallas that got in touch with me. Again, somebody who had watched one of the presentations up on YouTube and all of that. And she said her name's Kathleen. Doesn't want her last name used. But she called me one day and said, I have information for you because I can put together Carlos Marcello and Jack Ruby just before the assassination in October of 1963. So I called her back and she said, here's the deal. I was probably about 10 years old when I have a great memory of those years. And we lived in Dallas, and my father was involved in the oil business with all of the big names and everything else like that. But we also knew that he was kind of, and she used the word, connected. And I said, is that right? And she said, yes. And she said, I lived in Tulsa for a while, but I would come to Dallas in the summers. And I would go to my father's home. And one time he said, listen, I got somebody I want you to meet. And this man walked in. And she said, Kathleen, this is your Uncle Carly. All right? And she looked at this guy, and he was very immaculately dressed, swept back hair, short, all of this. And she said, you know, Uncle Carly, he said, yeah, he's not really your uncle, but that's how we look at him, as being a member of our family. So Uncle Carly, well, Carly. So she then says, well, what happened there is I was there various times when he was there, and he and my father and grandfather, they would go back in the room and talk and everything. But one time, my dad came out and he said, hey, Uncle Carly's going down to the Adolphus Hotel in downtown Dallas, which, as you know, is pretty close to Daley Plaza. And would you like to go with him, because your mom and I have to go somewhere? And she said, well, sure. So she got in the car with him, and she vividly describes then when she got to the breakfast nook there in the Adolphus Hotel, where I've been because I've spoken 2 or 3 times there at conferences. And she said there were these, you know, it was the old-fashioned counter with the stools, and then there were the tables over here and everything. And Uncle Carly knew everybody in there, and he introduced me as his, you know, you know, I don't know, a granddaughter or whatever it was like that. And I was all dressed up and everything. And then I looked around the room and I saw these men, and then there was one in particular caught my eye. And she said, we then went back and everything, and he would still be at the home. He never took me down there again. But at one point then, after JFK was assassinated, I saw this photograph of Jack Ruby. And I know that that was Jack Ruby that was at the table with Carlos Marcello. But that whole situation, what you talked about with the oil business again in Dallas, I've known some about that, but I've never looked into it maybe as much as I should, because that seems a common denominator as to what was going on there at the time of the assassination, right? Yeah.
And so this is crazy. How about this connection? So if you make that oil connection, and you can do that, this leads back to Prescott Bush Union Bank. Now, Prescott Bush and the House of Harriman, they took out an ad in the LA Times in the 1950s looking for a politician with absolutely no morals that is incredibly malleable. And you know who answered that ad? Richard Nixon.
Is that right?
That is right. You can find this.
Wow.
Very well documented on the side. So this makes that connection right there to Richard Nixon. I mean, the LBJ, the whole connection there to the Texas oil tycoons, right? And then you have the New York bankers, you have the Northeastern bankers, the robber barons that come into play. The robber barons all fund this. This leads directly back to the Rothschilds, if you want to even go that far back. You know, I mean, you go into the whole J.P. Morgan, how he funded it. They all funded the Nazis through Union Bank.
Right.
Morgan, the Rothschilds, but Morgan only owned 17% of J.P. Morgan. The other 80% so was owned by the Rothschilds. But getting into this...
you know, Kathleen mentioned the name Murchison to me. Murchison, of having some connections to her father and grandfather. Wasn't he a big oil...
I think he was, yeah.
Deal back then? Okay. I remember now her telling me that. So that all connects in there. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
Now, what's really interesting, I find, is one connection to LBJ was his girlfriend, and this was Melinda Brown. And she did the interview, I think back in the 70s, where she talked about this meeting the night before. I believe it was at the hotel you're talking about. Yeah. And she comes out and says he came out of that meeting stormy mad, and he had a temper like you would never believe. She's talking about LBJ. And he said, tomorrow we're going to be done with that SOB. We're never going to have to worry about that SOB again. And she was saying this about literally LBJ. And then you had the wink that heard around the world.
How about a connection between LBJ and Marcello? Is that solid at all?
I'd have to look
as much as maybe I should.
You know, I don't know. I know there's at the same time there's the Bobby Baker scandal going on with LBJ, so he was worried about that. He knew that would uncover a lot of stuff if John F. Kennedy was left to stay alive, and he would probably fall down because of that. They were about to lose billions. Now I'm curious. I think Marcello comes in the connections there with the Cubans, and this would be the brokering of those deals.
And that's true. Traficante.
Yes.
The Miami, Tampa mobster down there. That quiet, like Meyer Lansky. If you walked up to him, you would think he was just this cute little nice little businessmen, and yet they were lethal killers and everything. But as you remember, those guys owned a lot of casinos in Cuba, and when Castro took over, I believe, or Batista, one or the other, they confiscated all of that, and they even put Traficante in jail. But the link, by the way, between Traficante, James Hoffa, and Marcello is a lawyer in Florida named Frank Regano. And I interviewed his wife because at one point, Traficante kind of hit on her at a party they had. And Melvin Belli, then Ruby's lawyer, represented Regano in a matter in New York. And there's a photograph that I have in Collateral Damage and also in the other books where you have a table in New York where you've got Traficante, Marcello, Frank Regano, all these people together. So that was kind of an interesting group that way. And there's obviously more connections to that, to those people.
Yep, yeah. And one other name in Texas for a Texas oil tycoon that probably is a connection between Marcello and LBJ is Harrison Lafayette Hunt.
The Hunt
That's
brothers.
It. Yep. Yes. And that leads obviously to E. Howard Hunt, who became a CIA agent, who is believed to be one of the shooters on the ground on the grassy knoll.
Mm-hmm. Oh, what a puzzle we weave here.
Yeah. Speaking of Hoffa, did you hear about there's Fox Nation did a couple investigations and they think they know where Hoffa's buried now? No. This is like really, really good.
Well,
so they said that he was buried put in a barrel and that he actually couldn't go in feet first. They had to put him in head first. And when they buried him in this dump in New Jersey, they put the guy that says he did this, put a barrel in and then put other barrels on top of him and then buried him. And so Fox Nation went in and actually did ground sonar. And guess what they found there? Barrels stacked on top of barrels.
Ah.
Wow.
And so it's this evidence, this new evidence about Hoffa being there is really, really
have they dug all that up yet or not? Are they going to?
Yes, they are. Now they're opening back up. The FBI is opening up the case, and they're going to go in there and try to open this up. The article is really, really good.
I hope it will happen because remember what a terrible time Geraldo Rivera had when they were going to expose all that, and then it wasn't there or anything. That's interesting because ironically, there's maybe you've heard of it. There's a very well-known radio show called Coast to Coast with George Norrie.
Absolutely.
And I've been on there several times, and George and I have become friends. This last time when it was on, and even the time before, he told me a story because he was had a radio show in Detroit, and he says he believes that he's the last person to have interviewed James Hoffa before he died.
Huh.
And George has always had this belief that he knows apparently where Hoffa may be. I'm going to pass that information along to him, Jay, because he may not be aware of it, and I think he'd be very interested in that. I hope. Do they have any schedule where they're going to go in there and take a look at those barrels? I mean, that's probably the greatest mystery that ever lived, right? Where's James Hoffa?
Yeah. Yeah, Jay, you're gonna have to send that information over so we can get it over.
I sent it over in the chat.
Oh, awesome! So you know. Yeah, so it's right there in the Zoom chat, Mark.
Yeah.
Now, Arnold Roland. Have you heard that name before?
I'm afraid your audiences think I'm gonna.
No, it's okay. No, it's okay.
I don't know who that is. Arnold who?
Arnold Roland was interviewed after the JFK assassination. He was at Dealey Plaza, and he witnessed a man that he thought was security at the top of the book's depository, at the top on the roof.
I've never heard that before. No.
And he thought it was Secret Service or something like that because he said he had a gun. And so this gives credence to the multiple shooters because we know Lee Harvey Oswald was not on the roof.
No, we know he wasn't. All that's who knows? I still go back to the police chief, the overpass. But who knows? I don't know that we'll ever know about what exactly happened there in Dealey Plaza. Of course, if you really think about it, that parade route was just a death trap.
Right.
Have you been to Dealey Plaza? I mean, if you do, and it's a dead end. You go in there, you can't go out. I mean, it just was a perfect setup, kind of a mafia type thing, you would think, or whatever.
Well,
Secret Service or CIA or something. I mean, he had nowhere to go. He was a sitting duck.
Well, and wasn't it also that his Secret Service agents, one of them went to jump on the back of the car and they kept on shooting him away, and he's going like this, and it's on the film of him sitting there looking around like, what are you talking about? I need to be right there. And they're like, no, go somewhere else. And that was the one way that they actually had the clear shot, is because he was not in his spot.
You know, I think you're like Dorothy Kilgallen. I am, and I think Jay probably is. You look for these little clues about things. She was very good about that. And you'll be interested to know that a guy, again, who'd watched one of my YouTube presentations, called me from Florida. And he was an architect in 1963. And the night before JFK went to Dallas, he told me a story. He said JFK had a big speaking engagement at one of the major hotels there in Miami. And you wouldn't have believed the security to protect the president.
Yeah.
The limousine didn't have the roof up. It was down. They had all of these people out there, you know, Secret Service and everybody else protecting him and everything. And he found that so ironic, because the next day when JFK is killed in Dallas, there's practically no security to protect him in an open limousine. So it was just a little thing that this guy told me, but it just made me wonder again about this as being a setup to kill JFK. It was just meant to be, because, again, it's like a death trap. You can't get out of there once you get in. There's no way to. Yeah.
That's
crazy.
You know what I'm fascinated about? This is Conversations on the Fringe.
Yeah.
So did Dorothy visit Roswell?
Yeah. In fact, it's quite interesting. I hate to keep saying it, but I love these tips from people. My email is mshawin@yahoo. My website is Mark Shaw Books. Please, if you have something I should know. A woman in Dallas came to me and said, I have information about Dorothy Kilgallen being in Roswell. And she went ahead and she said, number one, we have a photograph of her there. I'll see if I can find it while I'm talking.
Yeah.
She said, I have this photograph. I wish, Mark, that it was more clear, but this is what it looks like. And as you will see, Mark, on the far right of that photograph, there is a woman standing there.
Just hold it up a little bit. Hold it just up a little bit. No. Yep, right there. Up, just up. Right there. Perfect. Right there. Yep.
This woman right here, she says, is Dorothy Kilgallen. And if you look at photographs of Dorothy in that time period, 1954, that pretty much looks like Dorothy, and that is at Roswell. And then her friend, her aunt in New York City, she had a postcard that she sent to me, and you can see it right here. And it was August the 19th, 1954. It's from her aunt, Betty Towson. And it's from Dorothy. I've not left many messages, messages lately, but I hope you're having a pleasant summer. Spy reports have been very interesting. Love, Dorothy. And this was sent just after she supposedly was at Roswell. And of course, we already know about, she went to the UFO convention. We also know about her interest in UFOs in the CIA document. So I believe, yes, that Dorothy was there, and she's trying to find a little clearer picture of this, but that looks like Dorothy Kilgallen to me.
Now this is interesting, because we just connected three different people, two of them which knew each other, the other one who kind of knew Marilyn maybe a little bit in passing Dorothy, but with Dorothy, Marilyn, and John all have this UFO connection. Now, I wasn't alive in the 60s. What was the sentiment during that time about UFOs, about Roswell? I mean, did people even know about these things?
People thought you were crazy if you believed in UFOs, for the most part. I have a story that I can tell you where I found out that I really did believe in them. When I was with Good Morning America as a roving correspondent in 1978, 9, 80, right in there, they sent me to Arizona. And you may remember this account by Travis Walton.
I do.
All right. Well, I went to Arizona and I interviewed Travis Walton with an ABC Good Morning America camera crew. And he told me this story. He was in a phone booth, and he was with loggers in the forest, and he was in a phone booth. They were in the truck, and all at once this UFO landed, and they kidnapped him. As the other guys looked on in amazement and ran, being scared, and that they kept him for 5 days, and they deposited him in another telephone booth about 5 miles away. And you may not remember that they were suspecting these loggers of killing him.
Right.
And they were investigating them and everything. Well, Travis then surfaced. So I sat there, and I'm a curious guy and a little bit dubious of things, but I sat there and I listened to him, and I believed him. He finally wrote a book called Fire in the Sky, which became a film. But over the years, I would talk to him from time to time, and I thought he made perfect sense. So I felt like that maybe that was a prelude to then, what I found out about Dorothy. And as you know, I think I said on the show before, I think Dorothy chose me to write her story,
right.
And the reporter who knew too much. She's guided me with a lot of her, a lot of the evidence that I found and things like that, her photographs right up here on my wall, and all of that. But I think that experience with Walton made me think more about some of the things from the hereafter, and especially her story about the UFOs. If you go to that book of Walton's, you'll see his sketches of what those little green men look like and everything. And I think JFK really got obsessed with that for whatever reason. We don't know exactly, but there's 2 documents in Collateral Damage, and they'll both be in the paperback version as well, that really talk about the fact that he really wanted more information and an investigation and all of that. And apparently he shared that with Marilyn Monroe in phone calls, or Bobby shared it with Marilyn Monroe about JFK being obsessed with UFO. That's all in that CIA document.
So there was an interesting thing that happened during this time. JFK supposedly was talking to Khrushchev, and they had their secretaries, and there was a secretary at the embassy right there in D.C., and there was one that John sent to a park in Washington, D.C., and they were putting envelopes under there and trading the envelopes, and Khrushchev and JFK were talking and communicating. And the rumor was, this was pre-November, that they were talking about UFOs, and they were talking about ending the Cold War, uniting the world, and just doing a space race with what they already had per information on crash UFOs and utilizing this technology. And some believe that that's actually one of the reasons why JFK was assassinated.
Yeah, there is that theory, yes.
Yep. There's another one, which was Executive Order 11110, which John F. Kennedy wanted to abolish the Federal Reserve and go back to a sound currency. And this was in the midst of the Bretton Woods Agreement. And we know that when Nixon came in, they removed the Bretton Woods Agreement, got rid of gold as a back currency. But this would have basically just gotten rid of the full Federal Reserve, global reserve currency. And some say that that's one of the reasons that he was assassinations. What are your thoughts on both of those?
Well, again, I go back with Dorothy Kilgallen.
Yeah.
I've got to follow her path just because, I've really become the voice for Marilyn and Dorothy. And Dorothy, to me, she was there at the time of the JFK assassination and all of that. These are not the things you're talking about are not things she wrote about.
Right.
Now, your audience should know that when she died mysteriously in 1965, she had told her hairdresser, if the wrong people knew what I know about the JFK assassination, it would cost me my life. I'm afraid for my life and my family. I'm getting a gun, and she died shortly thereafter. Her JFK assassination investigation file disappeared and has never been found. I believe, frankly, that it's still out there. But Dorothy's butler's daughter, who I interviewed in New York for about 4 hours, and it's in Collateral Damage, said this account, that her father told her, and I have to watch with these third-party, accounts, but I think it's credible, that her father said on the morning that Dorothy's body was found, FBI agents or agents saying they were FBI or CIA came to the townhouse and confiscated all of her documents, files, everything else like that. So all of the things you're talking about could have been in that investigation file of hers.
Wow.
And I still believe at one point I'm going to find the damn thing.
Have you tried any FOIA requests?
How much luck do you think you have with those? Huh?
Yeah, I know.
I've tried everything I can with the New York Police Department. I went to see the New York police commissioner, and he guaranteed me they would get into Dorothy's murder and look in Dorothy's death and all that. Shook hands with him. I've filed those requests. You know, the damnedest thing about them is this. You file the request, they deny it. And then they tell you, well, you can go right ahead and appeal. But it's to the same people that denied it in the first place. So I've probably filed 10 or 15 of those darn things. I've yet to have much success with it.
Oh, man.
I'll keep trying. You never know.
I mean, I haven't seen much come out in the sense of the JFK
Well, they
files.
redact the pages, you know, all the black in there.
Yeah, they just send you a whole bunch of black pages. I mean, that's
exactly.
the best way to do it.
Transparency. That's government transparency.
You know, that's a whole different story right there, is how bad the bureaucracy has gotten with crime and corruption. And it stems from, I mean, a lot in part, it stems from that moment in Daley Plaza when JFK was assassinated.
Yeah. We lost our innocence then. It changed everything. And it didn't have to happen. It just didn't have to happen. But I'll tell you, Bobby was a bad guy. And, you know, I don't know if you've ever read his book, The Enemy Within. But that's why he was in L.A. During the summer of '62. And then, you know, I proved that he wasn't in San Francisco on the day that Marilyn died. A helicopter with he and Peter Lawford landed at LAX and all of that. But he was in L.A. because he had published The Enemy Within, and they were going to try to make a movie out of it. If you read that book and you're a mafioso, I'll tell you, you would want to shoot him right away. Talk about their slick back hair and their fancy clothes, and it's just derogatory towards them. And you can't screw around with those guys. I don't know. Did I tell you my mafia story the last time I was here? You'll just take a couple seconds.
Do it.
When I was with Good Morning America, they asked me to go to Philadelphia because they couldn't believe it, but there was the mafia boss of Philadelphia's lawyer who would allow an interview. So I went to Philadelphia with a film crew, and I went to this guy's office. He was a lawyer for Angelo Bruno, who was a big name in Philadelphia, the mob boss. Yeah. And so I sat down with this guy, and we started talking with the camera. And he was telling me things about their looking into Atlantic City with gambling and everything else like that. And I kept thinking, are you really sure you should be telling me this? So we got it. We aired it on Good Morning America the next morning, and it was a huge hit. And so the producer called quickly and said, Mark, have you left Philadelphia? I said, no. He said, well, go back and see if he'll talk to you again. So I got on the phone, true story, got on the phone, called his office, and I said, is Mr. Such and Such there? Yeah. And there was silence. And I said, excuse me, but is Mr. Such and Such? And she came on, this woman came on the line, and I could tell that she was upset. And I said, are you okay? And I could tell she was crying. She said, well, Mr. Shaw, you don't know. This morning he started his car and it blew up. True story. You can't fool around with those guys.
No.
With that kind of thing. You can't say those kind of things about them or deport them illegally or whatever it is. I mean, Bobby Kennedy was the dumbest person in the world to do that. And after JFK died, he knew he was the dumbest person in the world. RFK Jr. has said several times in the last few years that Bobby knew it was Carlos Marcello who killed his brother.
Huh. We got a connection to the Junior. I'm gonna have to ask him that. So I'm curious though, with that, why didn't Marcello? Why didn't Giaccani? Why didn't they just throw Bobby under the bus and be done with it?
Well, because they feel like JFK is going to come after them if they do that. They want to kill him, that's for sure. So they just can't take that chance, you know. And it makes pretty much logic. You know, you talked about the head and the thing and the whatever, you kill the head, the tail, whatever it is, that saying. He was a smart guy, Marcello. He's not going to kill Bobby because then JFK is going to come after him. But if you kill JFK, Bobby's powerless. He dumped the Hoffa squad, which they called it, which is investigating Hoffa and all the mafioso. They disbanded that in about a week. They never came after them again.
Huh.
That's the proof.
Now, is the Marcello family still around? Are they still power and wealth?
Well, in the FBI file, I'm laughing because he has a son I don't know how old he is now, but it says basically that Carlos is upset because his son is not smart enough in any way to run any of the businesses he has. But I'm told by a source in New Orleans, actually two of them who have asked their names not be used, and they're in Collateral Damage, who knew Marcelo, and from being in bars and whatever it was that way. And they said to me that, his family, that's a huge family. And it's their belief that under the surface, the Marcelo family still operates an awful lot of illegal businesses around there. So he probably still does have family there. I don't know if you remember, in 81, I believe it is, he got indicted for trying to bribe a judge. Mm-hmm. And then he finally died, I think, in 92.
Huh.
Yeah.
There's so many points of interest. You could spend a lifetime, obviously, investigating this. What's even more interesting, too, is the upper echelon of the criminal activity a lot of these people were involved in, and you actually touched on that earlier. And this is where it really gets, I think, to it. I mean, killing presidents is nothing compared to what they go to the next level, and this is the Jeffrey Epstein stuff. This is not multinational corporations, but foreign governments. This is heads of state. This is, child pedophilia rings, human trafficking rings, and doing some really, really crazy things with them. And I know you're very dedicated to Dorothy and investigating that, but have you ever pondered that route and started looking into the Epstein stuff, Ghislaine Maxwell?
Well, there's no question you start there with this is just too coincidental that he died.
Yeah.
So what do you have to do? And I haven't done that yet because I just had Collateral Damage come out. But I'm going to look into it, and I'm going to look at suspects. I'm going to look at suspects and motive. I mean, you've got the what's the part of the British royal family, whatever his name was. They photographed him with Epstein for sure, and girls and things like that. You've got Bill Clinton. You've got all these other people. Somebody had to pull the plug on Epstein. They could not possibly have let him get into court. If he faced a life sentence, for instance, you don't think he was going to blab everything that he knew? There's these kinds of cases. This is the first time I've said this on the air. I'm very suspicious of Kobe Bryant's death.
Yeah, 100%.
100%.
Yep.
John F. Kennedy Jr. But Kobe Bryant's death, the whole situation, in my opinion, I was an ESPN reporter at the Kobe Bryant case in Colorado when he was charged with rape.
Yeah.
And through his lawyer's unethical conduct, they revealed the name of the witness in a pretrial hearing. It destroyed her life. But I knew all the evidence against Kobe Bryant, and there's no question in my mind that he was a rapist. No question. And I've always then wondered if somehow or another there wasn't something that happened with a connection between the victim in that case, whose life was destroyed. They had a settlement of some sort, but life was destroyed. And that some way or another, they were going to come after Kobe, one way or another. Now, whether I'll ever be able to prove that there's a connection between that family and a brother or a father or a relative of some sort who said, we're not going to let him get away with that because he should have gone to prison.
Yeah.
Should have gone to prison based on the evidence that I talked about on the air for ESPN. So those kind of cases really bother me. The Epstein case bothers me. JFK Jr. dying in that plane crash, there's more to that, I think. Yep. I don't want to look like a conspiracy theory guy because I don't like that word, but there can be plots to kill people. I'd rather use those words. And some of these things need to be explained for sure.
Well, at the end of the day, Mark, is men, women, and groups and organizations conspire for power, for money, and so forth. I actually like conspiracy theory because what I like to do is I like to hypercritically analyze them. I like to see the 99% junk that's within them that is considered just jargon and conspiracy and actually dig into them and find the truth. Now, the Kobe Bryant thing, one interesting fact about this, are you aware of the Simpsons episode that aired 10 years prior to that showed Kobe Bryant dying in the Hollywood Hills in a helicopter?
No, I was not. I am not. No.
To me, isn't that just like a Simpsons episode, a cartoon episode, shows Kobe Bryant dying in the same place in a helicopter.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And 10 years later, he dies like that. Now, I can tell you what that is because I've had 25 years of researching the occult and esotericism. And in that whole world, are you familiar with the New Age movement?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So one thing that when you get into esotericism, you get into occultism and you research this stuff really, really deep, like I did for a very long time, is you realize that at some point, all these things became hijacked by somebody. So we get back to the secret societies. A lot of these secret societies, the Freemasons, all these guys, they're nothing. They were just, bearers of information, of knowledge, right? And you had to be initiated to get this knowledge. And once you get in and you rise up the ranks, you get variations of levels of knowledge. Around 1650, we come out of medieval alchemy. We have the alchemical societies come about, and they start getting hijacked at that point. The Freemasons in the late 1700s, the Theosophists in the late 1800s, and in the 1900s, you have the birth of the New Age movement, which was actually birthed out of the hijacked of the Theosophist Society. This is Madame Blavatsky, and you have a woman by the name of Alice Bailey, who was the girlfriend to Aleister Crowley, and she creates what's known as the Lucifer Trust, or the Lucifer Trust. And the Lucifer Trust is still going on today. And they become a big publishing company. They hijack a lot of the theories, the philosophies, a lot of the principles of these different New Age philosophies. And they start publishing all these stuff through various different venues. And they basically turn it into what we would know as modern day Luciferianism or Satanism, which are two different things. But in occultism, Luciferianism means deception. And so it's the deceptive light. So think about this as everything around you is reflecting or refracting light. Your brain interprets it through bioelectrical and biochemical signals that come down your optic nerve, go into your cerebral cortex, into the deepest, darkest spots of your mind, giving you an illusion of what it believes is out there. Well, it's a deception. What you believe is what you're seeing out here is not actually what's there. It's only what your mind believes. So this is kind of the concept of Lucifer. It's the same thing with Buddha and Maya, how he was tempted by Maya, and he defeated Maya over many, many weeks of meditation. Now, Satanism is basically derivation through ignorance. It's the removal of knowledge from the system and leaving ignorance to basically reign. And so it's occulting knowledge, leaving ignorance behind, and then feeding that ignorance to the benefit of yourself. That's kind of Satanism. But the thing is everything delves around something known as natural law. Natural law is just a certain principles that are in the universe that if you violate them, karmic action, right? If you violate them, you get bad karma. Well, Satanists have to operate within natural law, which means that they have to tell you what they're going to do before they do it. And so Kobe Bryant, obviously Simpsons episode 10 years behind, they told you exactly what they were going to do, and then 10 years later, they do it. Did you watch this whole rapper, the Travis Scott stuff?
Yes, I've seen some of that, yes.
Okay, so the symbolic breakdown of that is scary. Scary. We were doing this firsthand. We were actually on a Zoom call with our social media platform. We had about probably 20 or 30 people when it was all happening. And we were watching eyewitness accounts of people there saying people were just dropping dead, having heart attacks. It had nothing to do with the trampling. The trampling happened early on when it was still daylight out. When people started dropping dead of the heart attacks, this was later on into the show. Now, what's interesting is the actual video that he made for this song. He made a music video for this song that he was playing at the time all these people died. The music video had him wearing a shirt from another band called Pearl Jam. And it's got the figure 8 on it. And it's actually the Eye of Sauron from the Lord of the Rings. And it's in the infinity shape, 8. Now, what's interesting is at that Pearl Jam concert, that specific one that had that shirt came from, 8 people died at that concert.
Oh, my God.
Now, when he played this song, 8 people died on scene at that place. Not only that, is you had the Leviathan cross. His stage came out, extended, and was a cross. And you had 8 pillars of flame right there. That's the Leviathan cross. That's the satanic cross. You had them marching into the mouth of Baal. Baal is Moloch, the sacrificial god. This is also portrayed as Satan in modern day. So it's no secret that Hollywood and a lot of these elitists worship or at least sacrifice to this god Satan. And that they tell you what they're going to do. The symbology is always there. The symbology will always be their downfall. But when you start getting into the Epstein stuff, when you start getting into the ties to these elites, Prince Andrew, Hillary Clinton, that part right there that I'm talking about fits directly into that.
Yeah. The sad part about Kobe's death, and I do believe there's more to that than people know, is the other loss of life, the daughter and all of that. But there's going to be that collateral damage, just like there was with Dorothy and Marilyn because of Bobby Kennedy's action. That's what is more difficult for me to handle than the actual death of Kobe, because immediately when I heard what happened, I thought, it all comes around, and something happened here that perpetuated. This is not an accident. This is not an accident, Mark, and I still believe that.
I 100% agree with you. Is that we have some very evil people in this world who have perpetuated this throughout history, at least for the last 100 years. And JFK was one of the most recent aspects of this portrayal of violence, a coup of power, and a centralization of power, if you want to look at it like that as well. Mark,
you probably thought of this, by the way, but just look at the violence there in 6 years. And there's more than that, because you got Martin Luther King's death in there too. Marilyn, JFK, Dorothy, Bobby, and Martin Luther King, within just such a short time there. It may even be somebody else, but it's mind-boggling when you think about that.
Well, and then you also take into account all the other deaths that occurred. You ever know the Laurel Canyon conspiracy?
I do not.
So Laurel Canyon in the Hollywood Hills there.
I know where that is, yes.
There is an old Air Force base that used to be up there. And this Air Force base is said to be the birth of the hippie movement. They're the ones that created this whole hippie progressive movement there in Haight-Ashbury up in San Francisco and LA. And it's interesting because there's a series of musicians and actors that live in a 10-mile radius of that military base. Cat Stevens being one of them. One of the members of the Mamas and the Papas. Jim Morrison's dad was actually stationed there for a short time. Jim Morrison went to college right down the street from there. A lot of those people died within that same time period of the 60s.
I'll have to look into that.
Yeah.
Well, is that Laurel Canyon conspiracy? Is that what you said?
Oh yeah, Laurel Canyon. It's a good one. We've been trying to do a show on it. It's just I can't find any experts on it other than the information that I already know. So it makes me kind of like the subject matter expert, which I'm definitely not. But
is that where Manson, the Manson Ranch and all that?
That is it. That's it.
I know exactly where that is. Yeah. Wow.
And that happened around that same time.
Yeah.
But Jimi Hendrix was in that area during that time. He died of a drug overdose. You had, what's her name? What was that female singer? Now I'm forgetting her name.
Janis Joplin?
Janis Joplin. Yeah. Yep, another one. Jim Morrison died during that time. It is just, it's crazy. There are no coincidences.
Oh, no, I don't believe there are. Yep. Not at all. It's all meant to be some way or another. That's for sure. And people have said, wait a minute, Mark. Are you basing your research on Dorothy Kilgallen talking to you from the hereafter? And I said, well, in some ways I am, and I think it's pretty credible, and I try to confirm it all and everything, but why not?
Have you ever met with a psychic that is a medium to help you with that?
And a lot of them have been suggested to me.
Okay.
And I talked to one especially, but more than anything, I have Dorothy, so I'm not so sure I really need somebody like that, because I wake up in the middle of the night with an idea or something. The name of the book, The Reporter Who Knew Too Much, came from Dorothy in the middle of the night. Collateral Damage came from her. A lot of my titles come from there. Or she'll kind of nudge me. I'll tell you how I found her autopsy, which had never been published before. I couldn't get it from the New York Police Department because I'm not a family member. So I wake up in the middle of the night and I have this feeling about the National Archives. And my wife's a librarian, and one of her best friends is at the Library of Congress. So the next morning, I listened. The next morning, we sent an email to her friend. Her friend walked over to the walked over to the National Archives, looked under Dorothy Kilgallen, came to a box of material, presto,
Wow.
there was the autopsy, and it makes all the difference in terms of showing that Dorothy did not die accidentally of an overdose. So these are the things that happen, and they're meant to be. And I you know, that's just what's happened to me. Dorothy's handled all that for me. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you so much, Mark, and it's people like you that help the truth come out into the world, and it's your dedication and your effort that you put forth to really bring this home and tell the truth and the story of Dorothy, which would have been a dead story if you had never picked up on it, as well as Marilyn, and connecting that to Bobby, as well as JFK, and showing all those connections. I think that you are doing history justice by moving forth with your research.
Well, so are you guys, and I have such respect for you. And I've got some research to do on Averill Harriman, the bank you talked about, Arnold Rowland, and and I may have to take a trip down to Laurel Canyon at some point and take a look down there and see what used to be there. It's too bad they didn't have a concert there with all of those musical icons. Boy, that would have been something, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that would have been crazy. Very cool. So what do you have coming up here in the future? Any speaking engagements other than the movie?
Well, working on with the documentary and everything. Yep. And then I'm going to take a little bit of a break, I think, and start to think about what else I want to do. And I'm sure the idea will come to me from Dorothy or whatever. I've gotten to be interested a little bit in Mary Pinchot Meyer's death. That's one of JFK's mistresses. And there's a lot about her that's interesting to me. She died in October of 1964.
Interesting.
So it's not too far within a year of JFK's death. They found her in a culvert or down by a canal in Washington, D.C. And there's also always been various accounts of what happened, but nobody has ever looked at her death in context with Marilyn, JFK, Mary, Dorothy. And I may do something with that to see if it makes any difference, because this was a wonderful woman, and her death to this day is unexplained. So I may look into that.
Now was she his current mistress at that time?
Well, there were so many, I don't know if you can use the word current, but she was one of them, that's for sure.
Did he suspect that his life was in danger at any point in time?
No, and I think it was the same way with Dorothy and with Marilyn. Especially with Dorothy, she thought she was invincible.
Wow.
If the wrong people knew what I know about the JFK assassination, cost me my life, but she didn't know anything about it.
Yeah.
Because they think they're invincible. Marilyn thought she was invincible. I don't think JFK would have ever thought that, although he did say at some particular point, I think, no, Bobby said, I thought it would be me. Bobby said, I thought it would be me. Wow. I don't think JFK thought that was going to happen. No.
Wow. Crazy. And we can find you at markshawbooks.com, correct?
You can, absolutely.
Awesome. And guys, he is linked up right there on our homepage on redpills.tv, and you can go right to his profile and find all of his books and his profile. Mark, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I can't wait to have you back on again, because we could sit here literally for hours and talk about this.
This is my favorite interview show. I love you guys, and the fact that you're so open to everything, and I really appreciate that. So thanks so much.
Appreciate it, Mark.
Take care now.
Guys, we will be right back with Fringe After Dark here in about 30 minutes. We'll give us till 9:40 Mountain Standard Time, 11:40 Pacific Time, or Eastern Time. We'll be back with Fringe After Dark, a subscription show. You can find that on the socialredpill.com. Everybody else, we love you. Take care. Much respect. God bless. And we'll see you guys all next time. Take care. Bye.